So tell me about your model. What's the model here? You've got very small classes, haven't you?
We have. The basic model that we've designed is for 60 student units, and then there are some innovations or some differences within.
So you call those mini schools, like?
We do, yeah, and that's the concept for the children. So they come to South Auckland Middle School, but they're either in Totara or Manuka, and within that they have there's a Year 7 class, Year 8 class, Year 9 class, Year 10 class, and they're in 15 students in a class. There's an academic manager in charge of both of those mini schools, and their most basic job is to make sure that every one of those children is moving ahead.
So basically you've got 4 classes,
yes.
15 kids in a class,
yep.
1 teacher to 15 children yep. ratio, and 60 is your unit.
Yep.
Because, what, small's beautiful?
At this particular age group, I think it's the most vulnerable age group within the New Zealand education system. It's a developmental stage between, say, ages 10 and 15, where there seems to be the development of some sort of cynicism about education. It's the age where children who have otherwise done well, apparently intuitively, begin to fall away because method and repetition and all of those things become a part of the educational framework, and it's not a natural thing for many children to have.
So how did you come up with this 15 ratio and this 60 unit ratio?
The 60 unit naturally flows on from the 15 because we're a four level middle school. The 15, so the research on class size is important from the perspective that class size makes no difference whatsoever if you don't do anything different. Because teachers tend to look at it and go, great, I've got 15 in the class, so I've got a little less report writing to do, I've got a little less marking to do. It's not such a burden being a teacher. Whereas our teachers come at it from quite a different perspective. 15 children in the class allows them to differentiate their teaching, allows them to get to know each student incredibly well, allows them to get the children to do really substantive pieces of work that they can then spend their time marking about.
Because a good teacher would do that. I mean,
yes.
that would be the benefit of having a small class size.
Absolutely.
Is you get to know these children
yep.
at a much more personal level than you would if it was a larger class.
Correct.
And you therefore make that a benefit. That's what you're aiming for.
Yeah, and sometimes we're asked, for instance, how would you deal with a learning difficulty like dyslexia or dyspraxia, and there are specialised interventions that we would help with. But even having 15 children in the class means that the teacher is able to spend that extra amount of time that their child needs.
But you've also got a small school unit.
Yes.
There's a benefit in that?
There is a benefit in that. This is scalable, so there is no inherent reason why these type of schools, middle schools with 15 children in the class and the 60 child unit, couldn't be 600 children. You would design your campus specifically for that, but there's no inherent reason for that not to be the case. So if you like, the small unit at the moment, or the small school, is because we're in a developmental stage. I mean, we've got long-term plans. We could be, we hope to still be doing what we're doing in 20 years' time.
So these are kind of like mini schools within a school.
Correct.
Do the parents pay fees here? What's the situation?
So under the partnership schools model in New Zealand, we're not actually allowed to charge parents donations. And so no one pays a donation, no one pays a fee. We also get all of our funding in bulk. So the schools are funded at about a decile 3 level, but instead of getting it allocated through the ministry for this, we get it in bulk. We get choices about how we spend the money. So we provide the children with their basic uniform. We provide the children with their basic stationery. And so the aim there is, again, you're in a situation where at the beginning of the school year, for those families, that has a really significant impact. For some of those families, it's saving $400 or $500. If you add fees onto that, it's possibly, or donations, it's saving maybe $700. In the first month of the year, that's extraordinarily important to them.
Because, so, if I got this right there, a public school could do this if it was allowed to spend its operational budget any way it liked.
Yes, they could make that choice. I mean, I've worked in state schools. I would argue that it's feasible now. My best calculation is that it would be about 3% of their operating budget. And so, the gripe towards us that we're super funded to be able to do that, it's not accurate. We've made some choices because of bulk funding, but I would also guess that there would be some resource choices that would allow them to do the same.
Well, let's go back on this for a moment, is that this model, how come you couldn't do this in the public system? Why do you have to be a charter school?
Sure. Again, that's something that's we think been repeated inaccurately quite a lot over the last 2 or 3 years. So we operated a small private school in Newmarket and continue to do so, a very successful school called Mount Hobson Middle School. And during the last 10 to 12 years, or even when we began it, we went into the Ministry of Education. That was back in 2002. It was under a Labour government. And we pushed quite hard to get information about becoming a special character school or about integration. We were simply told that both weren't feasible. Therefore, we chose at that time to take significant risk as a family and set up a small private school. The process for setting up a small private school or any private school is 4 pieces of paper. You have to show that you've got reasonable facilities and that you've got 9 children, and you can go. Process for setting up a partnership school, 180-page application, very formidable panel to interview, very difficult interview process. You really have to show that you can do what you're supposed to do. But again, that's our opportunity. The special character, the integrated school was never feasible.
That's interesting because you are a not-for-profit.
Correct.
Which is, and we'll talk about that, the difference between a for-profit charter school and a not-for-profit charter school. Talk to me about the difference now. I mean, do you have extra funding that comes from, the church or? No
extra funding at all. So we run South Auckland Middle School solely on the basis of the government funding that's provided. We have to be very creative with that. So
who owns the building? So
this building is owned by a landlord. It happens to be the Elim Church, but we've got no connection with them. This just happened to be the best place that we could find in South Auckland. They have been extraordinarily good as landlords, and it's a really nice facility. But the funding for partnership school setup is about, for us, I think we got 1.3 million. That's to set up absolutely everything. So a typical state school setup in Auckland at the moment is about 30 to 40 million. And so I'm not going to say it's a shoestring because that's to disrespect the funding and disrespect the taxpayer money that went into it. But it's not a massive thing that you can do, start from scratch and build facilities, etc. So we don't carry a lot of infrastructure that state schools carry, and again, that's a resource choice.
Let's just talk about that for a moment, because there's a lot of things in the press saying that you get a lot more money per pupil.
Yes.
Something like $12,000 per pupil here, compared to sort of like $7,000 for a Decile 1 school. Is that accurate? I mean, per pupil, are you getting more money?
No, it's not accurate. First of all, I think ours currently is at 10 because we were funded to begin this year for 90 students. Which again we thought would be an extraordinary effort. That minimum funding has been misrepresented as well, because it's not the expectation of the number of students that you would get in your first year. That's the minimum feasible amount to run your school on as a system. We happen to exceed that, so we happen to quite quickly get to 100, then 105, then towards 110. So our per student unit amount is coming down. But any start-up school in New Zealand, so for instance the Hobsonville Point schools at the moment, will have a massive per student allocation if you budget it that way, because they're in a start-up phase. And so, no, we're not extraordinarily funded at all. As I said, our start-up funding is comparatively minimal, somewhere around 5%. And then we're at a Decile 3 funding, and as we get close to full, like any state school, our per student funding comes back. The other thing about those two figures is that the 7,000 figure that's often presented for state schools is an average. There are a significant number of state schools that are well above that. And the second thing about that figure is that it doesn't take into account buildings and it doesn't take into account centralised services. Whereas if you take a partnership school per unit funding in any year, it has to cover everything. So anything to do with ongoing buildings, anything to do with ongoing setup, anything to do with centralised services that are otherwise provided for state schools.
You see, you'll be very well aware of this from the criticism that comes from the public sector.
It's been fun.
But I mean, I think one of the concerns that people have is equity.
Sure.
You know, that these kids seem to be getting a better deal than kids in public schools. And is that fair?
No, you mean, do I think it's accurate that they're getting a better deal, or is it fair that they're getting a better deal?
Well, if you get no fees, you don't have to pay for your stationery,
yes,
and you don't have to pay for your uniform,
yep.
That's a better deal than the school down the road.
And 15 children in a class.
And 15 children in a class.
Yeah, but there are a lot of things that we're not funded for. So, for instance, one of the local schools said, well, we're not funded for uniform. Well, we're not funded for a gymnasium. We're not funded for a swimming pool. We're not funded for sports fields.
Most schools don't have swimming pools.
Well, correct, but there are still some that have, and those are things that I guess traditionally in New Zealand have been there. So those kind of infrastructures we're not funded for, so our children seek them elsewhere. So I guess there are two things. One is that a lot of what's been said about the funding in public is not accurate. And then the second thing, it's about the way that we use the funding for the benefit of the children and their families. So
do you have more freedom to do with the dollars that you get from the government?
Significantly. And it was interesting to us, for instance, Angela Roberts from the PPTA, when things like our ERA reports come out, said of course they're going to succeed because they're bulk funded. Well, one of the things the PPTA is most proud of is defeating bulk funding 10 or 12 years ago in New Zealand when it was mooted for secondary schools. Now I know a significant number of secondary school principals who would love that opportunity to make the resource choices that we are making.
There's a difference, however, between not-for-profit charter schools and for-profit charter schools. Do you have any concerns about for-profit charter schools?
Again, philosophically, not really, because in education at the moment there's a tremendous amount of people who make money out of schooling, and so IT providers make money out of schooling, cleaning organisations make money out of schooling. Teachers make money from providing their services to school. I mean, under economic theory, that's a wage or a salary, but in a sense it's still a return on providing your resource. I think great care needs to be required though. We've made a really straightforward choice that for the Trust it's a non-profit organisation, and I think if there were profit-based organisations providing these schools, first of all, they would struggle to make a significant return out of the funding that's been provided anyway. But secondly, it would need to be very clearly monitored either from a public perception perspective and from a protecting taxpayers' money or investment, if you like.
See, I chose to come to talk with you and to come to your school because you're actually performing the best of the lot of them at the moment, aren't you, really, in terms of the retention of students, building your roles. And also that you are a not-for-profit.
Yes.
Now, you've been to the States, and so have I, and there are people making significant amounts of money out of the charter school concept. And I think that's the worry. The worry you must recognise is that people think that they worry about the fact that we might be privatising our public school education system. What's your view about that?
We regard ourselves very much as a publicly provided but innovative school because it's taxpayer funds. One of the things that's skewing our perspective of what's happening, even in the United States, is that there's a tremendous amount of picking and choosing about which articles, if you like, go before the New Zealand public, or who are the people and what are the situations that are presented. I have spent time in not-for-profit schools in Florida and Tampa. We've been to KIPP schools in Jacksonville. We've been to Andre Agassi's school in Las Vegas. And I had the most extraordinary time meeting with educators in New York for 3 days and saw schools like Bronx Charter School for Excellence, the Achievement First schools, the KIPP schools.
And out of all of that, what did you gain And what concerns did you have?
Sure. I guess what I gained is we looked at what we're doing and we shared what we're doing, because it wasn't one-way traffic in terms of the discussions. We shared what we're doing. I gained a real sense of passion and innovation from a lot of the people that were involved. And I guess the other thing was, because I obviously sit within the New Zealand media framework as well, and hear these stories and these terrible people like Eva Mauschkowitz, and then you meet people involved in these organisations, and they are some of the most remarkable, passionate, caring people that you would find.
Who are making huge amounts of money?
Well, no, some of them are making significant salaries, and for the change that they're bringing, I think they deserve to.
There's 10 principals.
Yes.
Well, they're not called principals, so they have different names, CEOs
Sure.
and what have you. In New York City, that earn vastly more than the person who organises the education system for the entire of New York City. And that is the worry. The worry is, it's for me, the worry is not quite so much the not-for-profit. The worry for me is the privatised profit-making.
And I think that is something that we need to take massive care with in New Zealand, because a part of the New Zealand education system has been the egalitarian nature of it. That in New Zealand, because we also run the small private school, only a little over 4% of children in New Zealand are privately educated, whereas in Australia it's 40%. So there is a different tone here that has to be preserved. But I don't think, I take the people at their word who are interested in partnership schooling in New Zealand, and I've been called a Trojan horse for the undoing of the New Zealand education system. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. Our utter intent is to provide something different for children who are being failed year in, year out, generation in, generation out, who need something remarkably different. And that's the point of it.
I don't doubt for a moment, Alwyn, that you are genuinely motivated. And I don't doubt for a moment that the kids are learning in this school. I can just, I'm an ex-teacher. I can walk into a school, I can talk to a couple of kids, and I know whether there's good stuff going on here, there's bad stuff going on here, and there's good stuff going on here. The problem is equity. The problem is fairness for all of our children. If your kids get free, no fees, free school uniforms, and free stationery, every kid in the country should get this.
And why would I have a problem with that?
Exactly. I haven't got a problem with that.
And so to me, instead of, say, for instance, some of the schools, local schools, some of the teacher unions, etc., opposing what's happening here, I would use us as a tipping point or an indicator that this should be happening everywhere, and use us as a part of that advocacy role to say, look, the schools come into this area, the children and their families have flocked to it. For a school to begin and have 110 children walk up straight away is extraordinary. Clearly there's a desire for it. If those things that you've mentioned are appealing, and they're a way of getting children involved in their education and making better decisions, then advocate it more widely.
Just before I came here, I came across a Treasury paper briefing to the Minister coming in 2011. Basically saying, look, big schools, large schools are cost effective. And so they might be, but they might be socially ineffective.
Correct.
And what you're doing here, by saying mini schools, 15 kids, 60 in a unit, says, as a teacher, you know that the social connections, the connections between here and home, and we'll talk about that in a minute, are really important.
Massively important. And it's got to be something that's different. I've been in teaching since 1991. I sat and did some education papers in a postgraduate diploma at master's degree through Massey University in education. And the discussion 20 years ago, and using their terms, not mine, was what to do about the brown tail. What was to do about the struggles for Māori and Pacifica children, and then the subsequent social inequities that followed through. The overrepresentation in prison populations and the links to literacy or lack of it. In over 20 years, lots of people have tried. Good things have happened, but in a very significant way, the basic demographics haven't changed that much.
We've got some schools that are performing extraordinarily well, and the long tail.
Sure.
And it's because of socioeconomic, etc. And
well,
it's Maori and Pacific.
I'm going to argue that it's because of socioeconomics. Because from a schooling perspective, I think every time someone, whether they're through teacher unions, whether it's a principal of a school, every time someone says that children cannot perform because of socioeconomics, or that the correlation is 100% and all those sorts of things, the children at some level are going to believe that. The teachers at some level are going to believe that. Public education was set up way back to break cycles, to provide ways of children moving through the levels.
Well, there's a school down the road, Manurawa Intermediate, is doing a fantastic job.
It's doing a great job.
You know, now they have the same philosophy.
Yes.
We don't care where the kids come from. We're going to do our best.
They've got a very good principle.
Absolutely, and I'm with that. I'm with what happens within the school is important. But we both know that Maori and Pacifica kids aren't doing well, and it is connected to the economy and all of that. You know,
but a school can't take responsibility for that.
I agree.
And a school can't keep going back, or education organisations can't keep going back and say we can't do anything about this until there's equity in society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Because we'll just throw another 3 or 4 generations in the trash can as we go.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, but it can't be ignored. So what is the relationship between parents in the school, and how does that work? So
we've worked really hard at that. So with the 110 children who came in at the start of the year, we had a parents' evening where over 4 weeks where every child was represented. We then went back to the parents towards the end of term 3 and had a celebration of learning evening. We rang every family and we had 97 of those families back in and represented. We employed someone as a community liaison person. His job is interface between the families and the school, and his job is to go out there and find out what's going on and be alongside the families, because a tremendous amount happens for these families. And I guess in one sense we don't talk about that a lot with teaching staff. One of them asked why not, and I said, well, you know, I spent my third form, my family wasn't particularly well off, my third form was living in the back of a bus. I mean, the last thing I wanted the teachers at my school to know was about my family background, because I didn't want to be sitting in a class thinking, what do they know? Do they know about this? Do they know about that? And what impact that would have. So we've kind of separated that role off a little bit, but the person who's doing that job is doing tremendously well. You see, I hear this a lot, particularly with teachers who are working in lower socioeconomic areas. It's that, well, how do you deal with this? Well, we say one strategy is to say, when the kids come to school, everybody's equal. We're not going to worry about what happens outside the school gate. Can't do anything about that. We're going to do what we do really well. And I hear this a bit. But we can't pretend that what's happening outside the school gate doesn't influence very much why you're even here. Sure. And so that's our community liaison person's role, but also our academic managers, they clearly know what's going on. They're very supportive. I think one of the real successes out here for the teaching staff that we employed is incredibly quickly they broke down the them and us type situation between themselves and students. You have a reasonable number of Maori and Pacifica kids here. What's the kind of percentage in the school, roughly? I think it's around 87%, and the government asked us to identify how many were priority learners, which I think also included socioeconomics. We then said, well, it's incredibly difficult to ask families what they're earning per annum and things like that. So they've linked it back to the decile number of the schools that the children have come from previously, which takes us to about 93% for priority learners. Do you take their ethnicity into consideration when you're teaching them? And are you teaching Pacifica languages, or are you teaching Maori language? What do you do? One of the aspects with our project-based curriculum is the children can bring to bear on that their previous knowledge, their culture, their language. We also have it lined throughout our curriculum, so Year 9 Project 3 is Māori or Pacifica language and culture that they study extensively. Year 9 literacy project, and they're all cross-curricular, but that's the base for it, is New Zealand writing. We bring film in, we bring guest speakers in.
But do you teach language?
Yes, we do. So the Māori language and culture aspect works there. We also teach Spanish, and we do that in year 7 and year 10. And I guess...
Because it's the second most popular language in the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And also you're in a situation where, in one sense to me, the opportunity for Māori and Pacifica children in the New Zealand education system is a similar opportunity to, say, the Swiss children in Europe, in that they have bordering cultures. They have to learn 2 to 3 languages. They have to understand different cultural aspects.
You need to learn Chinese.
It's getting that way. And so we don't want to limit them either, because to me this is the best time ever to grow up. And so the tragedy of people missing out in this generation is they are missing out on remarkable times, not only in New Zealand but around the world. And we want to know in 5, 6, 7 years' time that a number of our children have gone and studied overseas, that maybe they've taken work overseas, that they're seeing themselves and their culture very much validated, but they're children of the world as well.
Let me tell you a difference instantly that I noticed in your school compared to, say, the charter school I went to in New York.
Yep.
You have quite a lot of high technology here in individualised learning.
Sure.
In New York and indeed in Shanghai, what I saw was very authoritarian teaching.
Yes.
A lot of bubble tests and,
Sure.
and a lot of pencil and paper. And I said, where are the computers? And I was shown a little room that had 3 computers in it. And that was a for-profit charter school.
Yeah.
And one couldn't help but think, you are saving money by doing low-tech delivery. You're not doing low-tech delivery. Do you worry about that kind of thing? That, you know, I don't want you necessarily to speak about other schools, but I mean, you must know that one of the ways that for-profit charter schools save money is by, you know, low-tech bubble test technology.
It's always been my philosophy since day one teaching that you whatever you do in school should be for the good of the child. So I'm on things like meeting averse, because a lot of schools, they sit around, they have meetings ad nauseum. So little of it is relevant to the teaching of the children, or there's so much that goes on in school that is about, or in schools that is about promoting, if you like, the school and the nature of that school. If it's not for the good of children, then it's a waste of time doing it, because that's why schools exist. And so we look at things like IT, and I think we've got a balance. The children do a lot of pen and paper work. Reading is tremendously important to us. That they are very good at basic math is important to us as well. But to not have the IT is to ignore
Life.
Yeah, well, basically how they will spend their working lives. And recreational.
I've made an assumption. I assume that every teacher here is qualified.
Sure.
And probably highly qualified.
Yep.
The concern with the charter school movement coming in is that unqualified teachers will be... Is that a concern for you?
Well, I mean, some of the things that you're bringing up, I mean, I almost laugh, because I think what happened 3 years ago was that a few of the organisations in New Zealand sat down and said, what are going to be our repetitious messages? And so they went through the profit motive, they went through, this is a failed model overseas, despite, you can go and find all sorts of successful situations, the non-qualified, non-registered teachers, and all this kind of stuff. And I think they did a really good job of repeating ad nauseum to media and to whoever wanted to listen that these would be the issues. On the registered teachers front, of course, you want the very best teachers standing in front of children and working with children, working alongside children, because I think then you're going to get the very best results. We don't for a moment think that a teacher is a teacher is a teacher. There are great teachers, and there are atrocious teachers receiving remarkable salaries in New Zealand.
There are good doctors and there are bad doctors.
Absolutely.
Good lawyers and bad lawyers.
Yeah. And so it's very, very much in our best interest to have great teachers here. One of the aspects of being a partnership school is we could have set up here and no one come through the gates. There's no zone, there's no obligation on anyone to come here. So unless we're providing, as you said, great IT, unless we're providing good teaching and learning, word of mouth will soon have the place empty.
But
Yep.
free uniforms, free stationery,
Yeah.
no fees.
Sure.
You're going to get people coming through the gate.
But they aren't there as inducements. I think that's really important to make clear. They're there as a way of lightening a burden on families. After all, it's taxpayer income and they're taxpayers. So to minimise the cost to provide the ideal of free schooling in New Zealand, which everyone advocated until we were providing free uniforms and free stationery, and suddenly they don't want free uniform and stationery because that's inequitable. And so the registered teachers thing, the other thing that I would advocate for that in New Zealand is I think our teacher training is archaic. And you're in a situation where, let's say someone at 35 years of age wants to go through a change of career and they'd like to become a teacher. They need to take a year out. They may have 3 children, they may have other commitments like mortgages, etc. To do it in a way where they can go and work in a school and work through a more apprentice type scheme through a process of registration. Maybe that becomes for them a 3 to 4 year process of registration, but they've done it under a teacher with significant skills and significant experience. To me, that's a much better process. And you may bring back into education some people who are superb teachers. So again, it's an opportunity.
In Finland,
Yep.
you can't get to be a teacher unless you've got a master's degree.
Yep.
Because their view is that the higher educated the teacher, the greater you lift the status of teachers,
Yep.
the more it becomes a profession like being a doctor or a lawyer. It's up that level.
Yeah.
One of our problems, I think, is that we've lost status for teachers. Is that when I was a teacher,
Yeah.
I was responsible for the education of children.
Sure.
Today, teachers are said to be accountable for them.
Yeah.
And there's a difference in those two words.
Yeah.
Responsibility suggests trust. Accountability suggests no trust. We're going to have to test. We're going to have to make sure you're doing your job.
Yeah.
Do you think there's been a change in this? Do you think there's been a change in the status of teachers over the last 20, 30 years?
My basic philosophy is that teachers should be so good that parents advocate for them. That if teachers are having to blow their own trumpets all the time, then there's a bit of an issue. In terms of teacher quality, it begins at primary school teaching, and I know when I applied to become a teacher back in, 1989, I think 1 in 6 were getting into it. Was Christchurch College of Education at the time. And it was a nerve-wracking, very difficult process to get through. I'm not sure what the numbers are, but I know that the process has been kind of broadened as to who can provide it, etc. I think we need to go back to our basic entrance requirements. And for primary school teaching, for instance, I think every primary school teacher should be required to have NCEA Level 3 Maths, NCEA Level 3 English, NCEA Level 3 Science. And if the nation as a whole, if you like, gets judged on pizza requirements and how children are doing, if the teachers themselves haven't got that level of qualification and background within the New Zealand curriculum, they can't teach it.
So where are you on testing, on national standards and things like that? What do you think about all of that? And and what kind of testing do you do?
Sure. So again, one of the 4 or 5 common statements is that these schools aren't accountable, and we have to report back to the minister 4 times a year on the performance of the school here. We've got within our contract accountability measures. Now, those accountability measures for our years 7 and 8 are built around national standards. I think national standards are still problematic. It's not a common test. There are aspects of it that I don't think have ever been completely solved. So obviously we've got that as a part of our contract, but we're looking at other holistic measures as well. So we want to know how they're doing, not just in reading, writing and maths. We want to know how they're doing in science. We want to know how they're doing in technology and things like product development. Their physical education is important to us. Their product and project work is really important to us.
Why do you want to know that? So that you can compare yourself with another school, or because it's diagnostic for the kid?
Oh, because then we know that if we're progressing the children in all of those areas, when they turn up at their Year 11 school and we continue to track them through, we think they're going to do much, much better than they would have otherwise. Reading, writing and maths are really important, but you read in social studies, you read in science, you communicate all the time in the areas.
You see, one of the issues that we've talked about, and how do you decide who's a good teacher and who isn't? And in difficult schools, a good teacher might just be somebody who the kids really want to get to school.
Yep, absolutely.
They may not be able to lift their test to up at their reading age by the time they leave them to where they should be, and they'll be trying as hard as they can, these teachers, but very good teachers can't be measured by the test results of children necessarily.
Yeah, well, even if you're going back to the national standards, I mean, we have to be much smarter as a nation about that. So instead of having these blanket national standards released, I think there needs to be another item in there which is talking about setting a base of where the children are when they come into any school and how much improvement they make. And if you like, that should be the main item that's kind of released about a school, the level of improvement that they're bringing about. And you're right, for some children, just getting them there and having them in the class begins to give them that opportunity to do it.
One of the concerns is that we put money into a school like yours, and we can't actually find out about it under the Official Information Act. And that's a bit of a worry.
Well, again, I don't think it's the means of bringing that about, or the process of bringing that about is not being accurately reported. And so any private business in New Zealand or private organisation isn't subject to the Official Information Act. And so when the government legislated that we would be private organisations providing education through taxpayer funding, then I guess they had that there. We are subject to the Official Information Act in that we present to the Minister every quarter. And so those documents are very much open and public documents. Our Education Review Office reports are subject to the Official Information Act. In fact, better than that, they're actually published.
But I can't think of another business in which, and you might be able to correct me here, in which public money is put in and then it's called private money.
Childcare.
Yeah, but that's another example of,
of
a charter
business.
education system.
Yeah, effectively it is. And I guess as well, again, we've been aware of the public concerns, and we've been incredibly open. And so anyone can walk into our school, they can ask us the hard questions, they can see our children at work, they can ask us about the resources that we've spent the money on. To us, we would love it if all of the schools were that open, because I think it's a public service aspect of it.
If you were put in charge of our public education system tomorrow, what would you do?
Goodness. I like what we're doing. I would identify schools that are really struggling, and I would target those schools. I'm not sure where the IES situation has got to, but the idea of I guess, change executive principals alongside principals in schools that have been strongly identified as struggling is important, bringing innovation in. I think the collaborative aspect is really important. There are schools, significant number of schools in Auckland whose NCEA level 1 pass rate is less than 60%. So in other words, 40% of their children, and these are the ones that are entered and are visible. It doesn't count students who have attritioned out in year 9 and 10. It doesn't count children who haven't been entered in year 11. And so there is a phenomenal amount of money going into perpetuating failure.